Welcome. Thank you for being here to celebrate the life of Dr. Charles W. Steger, Jr. Among those present today, we want to acknowledge Governor Ralph Northam, former Governor Gerald Baliles, Senator Mark Warner, Congressman Bob Goodlatte, Congressman Morgan Griffith, Dr. Teresa Sullivan, President of the University of Virginia, Dr. John Castine, President Emeritus of UVA, Dr. Brian Hemphill, President of Radford University, Dr. Robert Lindgren, President of Randolph-Macon University, Nancy Agee, Chair of the Board of the American Hospital Association and President and CEO of Carilion Clinic, Rector Dennis Tracy, and current and former members of the Virginia Tech Board of Visitors, officials from the Governor's Cabinet and the state and federal government, as well as former members of the Virginia General Assembly, and so many others around the Commonwealth who knew Dr. Steger personally. I will forever be grateful for the 4 years I had with Charles, as a friend and as a mentor. Nearly everyone in this theater has known Charles longer than I, so I recognize that my reflections on his life and career represent but a transient in his long and impactful service to Virginia Tech and to the Commonwealth. I am, however, the only person to follow him as president, so my brief comments will focus on his role as a steward and a guiding force for Virginia Tech and higher education in Virginia. Charles was a bold and visionary leader, a characterization that may seem to stand in contrast to his quiet and thoughtful persona. Yet look around you. We would not have this grand Anne and Ellen Fife Theater in the Moss Art Center's Street and Davis Performance Hall without his commitment to the arts and the power of aesthetics. When Yo-Yo Ma performed in this theater last fall, he and his colleagues shared that this is one of the top 5 performance venues in the world. You can be sure that without Charles driving this project, we would not be sitting here today. Our partnership with Carilion Clinic in Roanoke would not have happened without Charles's ability to see through the forest to the other side. He knew that Virginia Tech needed a medical school and a companion research institute. He also knew that it was a huge risk to embark on a novel partnership to build VTC from scratch. And yet here we are in our second decade with much of the health profession, the biomedical research community, and the entire population of the Roanoke Valley watching this bold experiment become more than anyone other than Charles and Ed Murphy could have imagined. And then there is the Virginia Tech Research Center in Arlington, a $100 million investment driven by Charles Steger's vision for Virginia Tech as the rural and urban land-grant for the Commonwealth, inventing the future of data, security, and autonomy in the technology policy capital of the world. Few university presidents, perhaps none, would have taken that leap, and I'm thankful every day that he did. And he raised all of these tent poles while guiding Virginia Tech through a healing process from the unprecedented tragedy of April 16, 2007. He passed the baton only when he was certain that the next president would be free to move the institution forward, always respectful and with a commitment never to forget. Thank you, Charles. Before I introduce the next speakers, I have the opportunity to share some reflections of those who could not be here today because they live and work in Switzerland. As everyone here knows, Charles Steger had a passion for ensuring that Virginia Tech became one with the world. He recognized that our scholarship and the experience of our students would be enriched by establishing lasting partnerships and friendships overseas. Decades ago, when as Dean of the College of Architecture, Charles Steger worked with Professors Olivio and Lucy Ferrari to establish an international facility in Switzerland. Members of the Olivio Ferrari Foundation are here with us today, watching via live stream. On their behalf, I would like to read the message they published in the Zurich daily newspaper upon news of Dr. Steger's passing. With deep sorrow, we bid farewell to Dr. Charles Steger, co-founder and first president of the Fondazione Olivia Ferrari, Riva San Vitale. With great vision, he was involved in setting up the Center for European Studies and Architecture in Riva San Vitale to bring the joy of European culture and architecture to young Americans and vice versa, to invite European students to Virginia Tech. In his honor, the Institute was renamed the Steger Center for International Scholarship in 2014. Confident, energetic, determined, but also with a fine humor, he pursued his ideals in the service of the university. Continuing, Charles Steger had a big, loving heart and a wonderful gift for finding personal access to people of all backgrounds. We remain with great esteem and respect and thank him for his faithful friendship. That message is from Paul Knox, Lucy Ferrari, Marissa Garzoni, Conrad Fry, and Daniela Doninelli. We share their sentiment and want to thank them and everyone present today for being part of Charles Steger's vision for Virginia Tech. I would also like to share a letter we received from the Town Council of Riva San Vitale and Mayor Fausto Medici. Dear ladies, dear sirs, we learned with sadness of the death of Virginia Tech President Emeritus Charles W. Steger. The Town Council remembers him fondly and with gratitude for the great efforts made in the realization and expansion of the Center for European Studies and Architecture located in Riva San Vitale. Thanks to him, we were able to host hundreds of students in our town, allowing them to learn and appreciate the places, the architecture, and the European culture. We extend to Janet, Christopher, and David our most sincere condolences. Charles touched the lives of so many people, as you will hear this afternoon. Our speakers today will be Reverend Dr. Michael Ellerbrock, Professor Nikki Giovanni, Mr. John Lawson, Dr. Ray Smoot, Mr. Ben Davenport, Senator Warner, Governor Northam, and Dr. Castine. Reverend Ellerbrock will now offer a prayer and reflections.
I'm sorry, Janet. Christopher and Jean, David and Allison, we are sorry. Turn around and take a look. Take a look. God is sorry. God hates death. God's promise to us is an eternal bond. Every university faces a basic question. Is its mission to use knowledge to build people, or to use people to build knowledge? President Steger made his choice. It is always about the people. Charles modeled Lincoln's land-grant vision that learning and discovery spark joy and wonder in the human condition. Charles guided a global academy organically rooted in the fruits of its people. Many people fear death twice. The first death is why we are here today. When Jesus got word that his friend Lazarus had died, he immediately wept. Then the author of life showed us that this is not the end. The second death, often more terrifying than the first, is the fear of being forgotten. Charles's legacy, stronger than Hokie Stone, is forever etched into the fabric of a better world. And so I ask you, please let us rise and pray together. Dear Lord, by whatever name and voice we know you, all you ask of us is to use our gifts. You gave us a sacred gift in Charles Steger. His mission complete, his legacy alive. Today, we give Charles back to you. Amen.
May 6, 2018, 9 or 10:30 p.m. The sun rose in the dark because my mother had opened the door so that Dr. Steger could easily make his way to heaven. I know they don't drink bourbon or scotch, but maybe a bottle of good champagne was popped when he arrived. I'm sure my mother or aunts greeted him with a beer, a 2017 Utopia, but others who had been there longer had a better bottle of Cabernet, 100 acres or something on that level. A good man went to good people, and surely there are those who will celebrate his vision and his work. But as for me, I just want to think of him proudly and with the love in my heart and the understanding that when asked, I never let him down.
My name is John Lawson. I'm a former member and rector of the Board of Visitors at Virginia Tech, and it's a pleasure to be with the family. All of our hearts are hurting, but Janet, Chris, David, Keith, Linda, and Jennifer, he was a good husband. He was a good brother. He was a good man. And I know all of us can feel his presence here today. I learned so much from Charles. When he first did his inaugural address, he started taking the university in a new direction. We were going to be not good, but the best research university in the country. That was his goal. And learning, discovery, and engagement was our strategic plan and direction. And he made that happen so quickly. Dr. Sands gave you a number of the projects and programs that he implemented that made a big difference. But there's even more than that. Charles was a true architect. Not only did he have 3 degrees and was the youngest dean of architecture in the country at the time, but he was an architect of our strategic direction for the 14 years that he served as president. A lot of you don't know that Charles would walk the campus weekly and sit and talk with students in small groups, just to show that, number one, he understood, but also he wanted to share their vision. Their vision. He wanted to share their vision and be a sounding board for the students to be able to tell the president what was important to them. And that's part of the engagement piece of the strategic plan. He was always either the vision or the executor of a vision that somebody else may have shared with him. His daydreams became a reality. Some of my favorite times were the many times that I was able to stay at the Grove, and after a long day, we'd be out on the second floor porch, and we'd have a scotch, and he would talk about the new things that were coming, and it was truly amazing. He was such an insightful person, as well as a true friend. Not everybody knows that he led 2 capital campaigns, not just one. Back in the 90s, I worked with him on the $250 million campaign that exceeded its goal by $83 million. And then we had the $1 billion campaign right through the worst recession that we've had in probably 80 or 90 years, never changed the completion date and exceeded that goal by $110 million. And he was right at the forefront the entire time. He was vice president of development in the 90s and, of course, president for the big campaign. The Riva San Vitale campus in Switzerland, wow, so many students have told me how that has changed their life. Changed their life. I asked him if we could have a board meeting there, and sure enough, despite the logistics, we had a Board of Visitors meeting in Switzerland, and we got to see firsthand how impactful that was. The expansion of the football stadium in both the west and the south ends was possible because of Charles Steger. The School of Construction, which has grown tremendously over the last 11 years, would not have happened without his encouragement and, of course, his approval. Goodwin Hall, wow, that building is phenomenal. And the things that are in research that Goodwin Hall and all of the laboratories and the grants that happen, tremendous. Bioinformatics, I never knew what bioinformatics was when he made that suggestion. It's the true cross-collaborative effort of engineering and biology. And of course, it's now named Steger Hall, the first bioinformatics building. Well, personal favorite of mine is the Tech Center project in Newport News, which is a research campus that would never have happened without his not only approval, but support. I mean, he was actively engaged. And then it is so appropriate that we have this memorial service here. I remember him coming up with, and I think it might have been a scotch on the second floor balcony, but he said he wanted to build a world-class performance hall. And I said, well, I thought our strategic direction was in research. And he says, it is. But we have to have the finest faculty and students. And there are places where they can get the arts and also research. We have to be able to have both because, in my experience, these are his words, talented people don't have just one talent. They have multiple talents. They will play the violin, be a performer, a singer, in addition to their expertise as a scientist or an entrepreneur. Charles changed this university. He certainly changed my life. He was a dear friend. I'm going to miss him terribly.
Janet, Christopher, David, members of the Steger family, colleagues, and friends. It is my honor and sadness today to talk about my long-term friendship and my long-term friend and colleague, Charles Steger. Charles and I entered as freshmen in the fall of 1965. We did not know each other. At that time, Virginia Tech was a college of about 7,000 students, known primarily for its programs in engineering, architecture, business, and agriculture. Programs in the social sciences and the liberal arts were nascent. Women composed less than 5% of the student body. Graduate enrollment was relatively small, and we became quickly acclimated to mediocre food and Spartan dormitories. Standing in line with us that late September afternoon were several others, each of whom is here today and who had major impacts within the Steger administration. Tom Tiller, who served as Vice President for Alumni Affairs. Frank Beamer, who served as head football coach. And Joe Meredith, who served and serves as the CEO of the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center. Also in line with us was Mark Music, who early in his career worked in the Virginia Tech administration and went on to head the Southern Region Education Board for many years, including some while Charles was president. We members of the class of '69, as I said, did not know each other. And we certainly had no inkling that our lives over the years, far into the future, would come together with Charles, working together to implement his vision for Virginia Tech and working with many others. Change and ambition were in the air. And later that week in 1965, we stood in line at the Grove to meet Virginia Tech's president, Marshall Hahn. Marshall had become president 3 years before, at the ripe old age of 35. He saw both the need and the opportunity to advance Virginia Tech to become a major land-grant university, drawing upon the model of those in the Midwest, which were large, comprehensive research universities. Thus began a 50-year process in which Charles played a central and defining role, playing it as a faculty member, a dean, a vice president, and for 14 years as president of Virginia Tech. I've been asked to share some perspectives on working with Charles over 35 years, and including several more as we served together as members of the Union Bank Board. During that time, we worked with many faculty, administrators, and alumni leaders to advance Virginia Tech into the ranks of premier land-grant universities where it resides today. And I hasten to add that this is still a work in progress, now under the leadership of Tim Sands, a continuing work which Charles applauded and assisted. Charles understood that both quality and appearance matter in higher education. Appearance without quality, he said, is a deceit and a fraud. But quality and appearance together is a powerful combination in growing the reputation of any institution. The building in which we gather today is an example of Charles' understanding of quality buoyed by appearance. As many know, Virginia Tech had never had even an adequate performance hall or lecture hall. Charles recognized the need to make a statement through having an exceptional facility. And he did make a statement about the importance of the arts within the university. He set about planning this exceptional Moss Arts Center we share here today, enlisting alumni, friends, and the state in a funding plan to make it reality. And Pat, we thank you for lending your name to this wonderful facility and for your support, which helped make it possible. Let me relate another story regarding Charles' quality and appearance. Charles was in London, and he called me one day to say that he had become aware that a violin made by Carlo Bergonzi, the greatest pupil of Antonio Stradivari, was about to go on the market. Charles asked that I contact the executive committee of the Virginia Tech Foundation to assess their interest in funding the acquisition of this violin, which he believed, if played by Virginia Tech faculty and students, would call attention to the university's interest in the arts. How much will it cost? I asked. I learned to ask that question often with Charles. Probably $750,000 or so, he said. So I set about discussing with executive committee members the acquisition of this violin. Several days later, I called Charles back and reported the bad news that at least several members of the executive committee did not share his enthusiasm for this acquisition. Charles said, "I will handle it. I have a plan." The day of the foundation board meeting arrived, and Charles made an eloquent presentation. Hardly had he finished when Cliff Garvin, our rector at the time, and also at the time chairman of the largest corporation in America, took to the floor to talk about how wonderful, what a brilliant idea this was, how great it would be for Virginia Tech, and concluded by saying, "And I move approval." It passed by a unanimous vote. And we saw Charles in several other venues exercised his persuasiveness in moving Virginia Tech forward. That is the violin played today by Professor David Ehrlich, its custodian and frequent player. And David and Teresa, thank you for all you contribute to the arts in our community and for the Renaissance Music Academy in Blacksburg, in which you enlist our community children in the appreciation and performance of great music. Many of you know that Charles did not have a great personal interest in sports. Yet he readily understood and embraced the view of Marshall Hahn that intercollegiate athletics provide a national stage on which to parade the academic as well as athletic talents of a university. Under Charles' direction, Virginia Tech renewed its quest for membership in the prestigious Atlantic Coast Conference. And with the helpful assistance of Menace Ridenow directing Virginia Tech's internal work to position the university for admission, and the great support of John Castine, Mark Warner, and others advocating publicly and privately, Virginia Tech was admitted to the conference in 2004. Plans for securing funding for the expansion and upgrading of Lane Stadium and our other athletic facilities were initiated and continue today with the recent upgrading of English Field at Union Park. Lane Stadium and John Scott Stadium are among the most attractive and highest quality venues for intercollegiate football in the United States. The reduction in state support to higher education began near the beginning of the Steger administration. This, combined with the ambitious academic, athletic, and other initiatives, underscored the need to increase significantly private funding to Virginia Tech. Under the leadership of Betsy Flanagan, Charles initiated a major capital campaign. After consultants advised that $750 million was the maximum that could be raised, Charles worked with our alumni and our friends to set the goal at $1 billion. The campaign was highly successful, as we all know, and exceeded its $1 billion goal, while also engaging a new generation of alumni and friends in Virginia Tech. Visionary is often used to describe Charles. In his inaugural address, against the advice of some of his advisors, including this one, Charles set a goal to advance Virginia Tech to be among the top 30 research universities in the United States. At the time, I think Virginia Tech was 72nd among research universities. But Charles fully understood that setting ambitious goals elicit the interest and the support of other people. And working closely with our faculty, Virginia Tech began to move up to where I believe in Charles' last year as president, it had moved from 72nd to 39 among research universities. I offer one other insight into Charles' character. Charles was proud to be a Virginian. He was proud of his family's roots in Buckingham County, where he visited many times on the longtime family property. He was cognizant of the increasing disparity in economic and health conditions across the Commonwealth, all factors which deny some regions of our state the well-being of other regions. When Ben Davenport and other civic leaders from Southern Virginia came to Charles early in his administration to seek his and Virginia Tech's assistance in addressing many issues caused by the decline in the tobacco, textile, and furniture industries, Charles immediately engaged Virginia Tech in assisting this region. Through the work of John Dooley, then Vice President for Outreach, and Tom Dingus, Director of the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, and many others, work began to support regional educational and job-creating initiatives. Truly an example of the modern land-grant university at its best. Another initiative that others have mentioned is the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine and Research Institute. Charles had the vision for this, and so did Ed Murphy, who was then CEO of Carilion Clinic. Later, Charles worked regularly with Nancy Agee, the current CEO of Carilion Clinic, to orchestrate the founding of a medical school and a research institute in Roanoke. Both have prospered, not only as visionary academic initiatives, but also as economic development catalysts for Western Virginia, which has responded with local government and business programs supporting entrepreneurship, STEM-H education, and creating an attractive environment and place for young professionals. Time does not permit speaking to many other such initiatives. Charles was a visionary, a hard worker, and seldom was distant from his job. Some of us thought he perhaps slept, Janet, in his coat and tie. We never saw him without one, or very seldom did. Charles was a kind person who led by example and was not critical of others. He was a Virginian, and he was a Hokie. He was a president mindful of both the responsibility and the potential of his office to improve the lives of others. A fine person to work with or for, and a person whose life's work surrounds us today and embodies our university's motto, ut prosum, that I may serve. This work will serve well generations to come in the Commonwealth, in the nation, and in the world. It has been, and it will continue to be, my privilege to call Charles friend. At my retirement dinner, Charles was a performer, something we didn't see him do very much, but I appreciated him doing that, and I told him afterwards, I said, I owe you one. So on my way back to my seat, I'm going to stop by the piano and share with you a song whose title is so much about Charles' relationship with and to Virginia Tech. This is Devotion by Jim Brickman.
My name is Ben Davenport. I have served as on the Virginia Tech Board of Visitors and also as rector. And Janet, thank you so much for allowing me this time to share about my friend, and to all the Steger family, David, Chris, and all the rest of you. Our hearts are with you. My first memory of working directly with Charles is in December of 1999. He was about to become the president of Virginia Tech, and I was meeting with him to ask for help. My home, Southern Virginia, was in a downward economic spiral, and my hope was to engage Virginia Tech in a new kind of outreach. Well, Charles quickly saw the infrastructure we could create, and through helping us, he began the creation of a new model for the role of a land-grant university. His backing attracted support from the General Assembly, and I'm happy to say the rest is history. Then, as a member of the Board of Visitors, I was privileged to spend more time with Charles and to get to know him personally. He loved to talk about our dogs and tell stories about a beagle he owned and loved. Betty and I would encourage him to get another dog, but he consistently deferred, saying it isn't time yet. Well, Betty and I decided to take matters into our own hands. Unbeknownst to Charles or Janet, we got a puppy from a friend's litter of hunting beagles. Housebroke him ourselves, kind of, sort of. I learned that later. And sent a letter, an advanced letter of introduction to Charles from the pup, in which the pup asked to be adopted. Then we nervously brought our gift to the grove. We were ushered into the study, and when Janet met us, she immediately got on the floor and began to play with the puppy. Whew. Betty and I were so relieved. We named him Beau for one of Charles's favorite architectural friends, Mario Boto of Switzerland. Charles and Beau were tight buddies, spending many an evening together in their favorite chair, visiting and napping and sharing the stories of the day. I think this love of Beau gives us a deeper insight into Charles. You see, everyone knows he had a remarkable intellect, that he was a leader of genuine persuasion and humility, a visionary with incredible foresight. All of these traits make up the outer wall, the facade of the construct that was Charles Steger. But beneath the countenance that led our university for 14 years, we have the framework of the man, the trusses and the eaves of who he was, a lover of dogs, and a graciously accepting friend. Looking back in my diary, I found an entry regarding a salmon fishing trip in June of 2013 to the Restigouche River in Canada with Charles, Ray Smoot, and John Lee. We had contests. First fish, most fish, biggest fish. The winner in each category got to choose a charity to which the other three had to make donations. Well, darn if Charles didn't win all three categories. And his biggest salmon was a whopper, a 20-pounder. Then I found the notes on our trip to Switzerland and France. On June the 12th, 2014, we officially named the center in Riva San Vitale the Steger Center for European Studies and Architecture. The honor was fitting for Charles since it had been his inspiration. Well, after the ceremony, several of us took off on a barge trip through French wine country, a trip that had been on Charles's bucket list. We were celebrating his 14-year tenure as president of Virginia Tech, and I think also helping him reframe his work and life. The day trips we took to villages and vineyards were magical. Charles talked 8 of us into taking a hot air balloon ride. Again, something on his bucket list. Betty said we were crazy. But who are we to say no? As many of you know, Charles was not easy to say no to. So off we went to survive and return and brag about the thrill of the adventure. At night, our group of 19 would recount the day's adventures, and invariably a sing-along would start up. Ray Smoot or Betty would play this electric keyboard we rented, and to my great surprise, Charles had a guitar, and I got to tell you, he was really good. So now you can see further beneath the gables and the cornices to the structure that made Charles such an effective leader. His careful skill and patience while fishing, his love of life and adventure, his capacity to toggle effortlessly between the language of words and the language of music, all of these mostly private facets of Charles undergirded the President Steger most people knew. Well, I'll share with you one last aspect of Charles I was blessed to know, his love of bird hunting. We enjoyed it so much that one time we even dressed up in full regalia of a proper English country gentleman. Knickers, a heavy woolen jacket, a tie, and of course, an appropriate hat. The pheasant had the decided advantage. They came at us fast and furious, right over our heads, but we looked grand just the same. Well, Charles loved to come to Bannister Bend for our annual dove hunt. It's always the first Saturday in September, unless the Hokies are playing, and then we'd have it on Monday. Charles rarely missed these hunts, and we loved having him there in our home with our friends and family. I will sorely miss my friend. He could catch the spirit of a moment like few others. He understood the importance of ceremony and tradition in building friendships and in building community. The house that Charles built was carefully and intricately crafted. As a university, we have catapulted to new heights by the sheer force of his intellect and vision. As his friend, I have known great joy and delight through him. I will miss my friend Charles.
Janet, and David, and Christopher, on behalf literally of millions of Virginians who couldn't be with us here today, we offer our sincerest condolences and sympathies. I first met Charles Steger back in the early 90s. I was a so-called up-and-coming tech guy. Charles Steger was a professor of architecture, and I got a chance to come over to your house in Blacksburg. We had a chance to sit and visit, and at that point I realized what an extraordinary individual, what a great visionary, as Ray and others have mentioned, this man was. His heart for all of Virginia, but specifically for Southwest Virginia, and how this part of the Commonwealth was going to be able to keep up in a world of ever-changing technology. That started a friendship. It's lasted for me almost 25 years. I want to share with you two brief examples of the kind of man, echoing what Ray and John and Ben have already said. First was back in 2004. Now, Virginia was once again in kind of some choppy budget times. Our bond rating was at risk. John Castine and Tim Sullivan, who was then President William & Mary, and Charles Steger came to me as governor and said, we got to get our fiscal house in order. And we decided to take a dive headfirst into a major tax reform plan. And a whole lot of you in this room, kind of whether you like to or not, because of Charles' ability to convince everyone who had been involved in Hokie Nation, somehow that became their fight as well. And against enormous, then political odds, and months of back and forth, at the end of the day, Virginia ended up getting that tax reform effort through, right at our fiscal house, and in many ways gave the initial investment that launched Virginia Tech's dramatic rise in research. Now, it's not good politics or necessarily good business for a university president to be involved in a legislative fight. Charles Steger knew what was best for Virginia Tech, and more importantly, best for Virginia. And he took that plunge without hesitation or reservation. The second story is one that has already been mentioned, and I was glad that Ray acknowledged this, because it was true that Charles probably sports was not his biggest love in life. I have constant impressions of a couple of visits I had at the Grove, and the host of donors and board members traipsing in and out of the house on every Hokie football Saturday. Charles was always there. And the battle that I want to talk about briefly was already been alluded to, and that was the question back in 2003 of whether Virginia Tech would get into the ACC. Now, word went out that the ACC was going to expand, and it was a done deal that Syracuse, Boston College, and Miami were going to get into the ACC. And I don't really recall whose original idea it was. I don't think it was Charles or mine. But they said, no, let's not do that. Actually, the more logical and rational choice is for Virginia Tech to get into the ACC. Well, everyone thought we were crazy. We thought we had no chance at all. But as Ray mentioned, with a whole lot of folks that are in this room, the Virginia Tech family and the Hokie Nation was relentless. We got a great assistant from John Castine. And we ended up both doing our jobs. Charles' job was to call other college presidents and say, hey, listen, Hokies travel unlike any other sports team around, and convince them that Virginia Tech joining the ACC would be a good idea. My job was to call other governors and political figures and try to convince them as well, and occasionally to remind certain members of the UVA board at that point that they served at the governor's pleasure. and that getting Virginia Tech into the ACC would have no detrimental effect on UVA. Well, there were more twists and turns to that story than any of us would care to record or recount. But when the dust had settled, the two schools that were accredited into the ACC was Miami and Virginia Tech. And Charles and I dreamed up a little celebration afterwards, so we thought a few months later that we would celebrate. So we got an opportunity to join Coach Beamer and the Tech team and do the famous walk into Lane Stadium. This was a game against Miami, and Miami at that point was ranked number 1 in the nation. And during the first half, the Hokies kicked their butt. And so Charles and I came out into that almost newly expanded Lane Stadium, full of screaming Hokie fans. We were both smart enough to make sure that our remarks consisted of about 10 seconds each. And for a brief moment in time, Charles Steger and Mark Warner had a 97% approval rating in Lane Stadium. And for years afterwards, we would talk about the fact that that was our peak time and it was all downhill from there. And over the last few years, as I've seen Charles, whether it was Blacksburg or he did frequent more often around Charlottesville recently, he still always brought that quiet intensity, that enormous curiosity about issues of the day and where Virginia and where our country was headed. In so many ways, has been indicated, Charles wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He never bragged on himself. He was simply quietly devoted to his family, to this community, to our Commonwealth and our country. Charles Steger was my friend, and he will be deeply missed by all of us.
Well, good afternoon, and on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia, it is a tremendous privilege for me to be here to share the memories of Dr. Steger. Just as you were, Pam and I were saddened by the loss of Dr. Steger, the man who was the architect of what we know as the modern-day Virginia Tech. Several weeks ago, I became aware of Dr. Steger's declining health, and I called him. He was as kind, humble, and gracious as when I first met him years ago at the Gold Cup horse race in the Plains. During that initial interaction, we talked mainly small talk about growing up in Virginia and horse racing. Shortly thereafter, he and his wife Janet invited me for dinner in their Blacksburg home. His admiration for our Commonwealth and his alma mater was obvious, and he shared his vision of investing in talent, emphasizing to me that talent attracts more talent. The numerous programs developed and built during his tenure, both in Blacksburg and in other parts of Virginia, have touched thousands of lives and have taken the Commonwealth to the next level. Dr. Steger built Virginia Tech into a school for a 21st century economy. And in doing so, he helped build Virginia itself into a steady state ready for the 21st century. As a doctor myself, I may be biased, but I have always been especially impressed at how he helped create the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine and Research Institute. Virginia's 5th medical school in partnership with Carilion. It will fully integrate with Tech in July, and I'm sorry that Dr. Steger won't be here to see that final step. The enormous talent at the Research Institute has provided for world-class research and development, grants, and business opportunities, being a win-win for patient care and for Virginia's economy. His advocacy for the arts and healthcare has changed STEM to STEAM-H education, preparing students in science, technology, engineering, the arts, math, and healthcare. Students are prepared for 21st century jobs, but they're also prepared to be good, thoughtful citizens. We know of his accomplishments, but what we remember also is that behind them, there was a man with a heart and an unwavering moral compass. He was a steady hand in a time of transition, and while he wasn't one to promote himself, he always stood ready to promote his beloved Virginia Tech. Dr. Steger had compassion, empathy, and a boundless capacity to love his students and his school. On Friday, I had the privilege of speaking at Tahoki's graduation. As I looked at the thousands of graduates and families that day, I couldn't help but think of the enormous impact Dr. Steger had on each person's education and life through his leadership of Virginia Tech. When you think about the number of classes that benefit from his vision for the university, you realize that Dr. Steger's influence reaches far beyond Blacksburg and will continue to ripple outward for years to come. He dedicated his life to Virginia Tech and our Commonwealth, and I know he would be proud of the graduates and all that Virginia Tech stands for. We grieve with the Hokie Nation and with Janet and the Steger family. Pam and I hope and pray that your fond memories of Dr. Steger will help you through these difficult times.
einzusehen von Angesicht. Alle, die von denen scheiden, alle Seelen ruhen im Frieden.
Janet, family members, Virginia Tech colleagues. I met Charles Steger during the early 1980s when he worked in the state buildings around the Capitol, and I worked there for then Governor Charles Robb. In those days, Charles came in company with President Bill Lavery or with Minister Ridenhour, others from Blacksburg, to conduct Virginia Tech's business in the Capitol. Charles was the relatively new dean of one of Virginia's most prominent schools, Tech School of Architecture. Always businesslike but cordial, he came and went quietly. When we met for Virginia Tech's affairs with the state, Charles was always prepared, always open to discussions of alternatives, always committed first and last to Virginia Tech. Later, during the 1990s, Charles was less often present in the places that I visited. He worked and led a capital funds campaign that brought Virginia Tech forward as a broadly acknowledged leader among America's top universities. At the same time, Leonard Sandridge and Bob Sweeney and others and I worked on UVA's first major capital funds campaign. Both campaigns, Tech's and UVA's, succeeded. Toward the end of the 1990s, Charles worked with Presidents McCormick and then Torgerson on Virginia Tech's plans to expand. And then as president, as you've heard, Charles came to be, for many of us, and certainly for me, the natural counterpart in Blacksburg. The effects of these two campaigns, planned and conducted in altogether public ways, were dramatic. The material effects, new campus plans, new buildings constructed during bleak times in state finance, and the human effects in new professorships and new job security for faculty and for staff, as well as also the protection of programs that might otherwise have been targets of retrenchment and of layoffs, and new measures of academic security and confidence for programs and for departments. These effects were both subtle and fundamental. The restructuring bill of 2005 and 2006, with support from Governors Warner and then Kane, and from all of the key members of the General Assembly, passed and took effect. And both universities began moving toward different but fundamentally compatible futures. Charles became Virginia Tech's president in the year 2000. We saw more of each other in Richmond and elsewhere. Leonard Sandridge in Charlottesville, Minister Ridenhour here in Blacksburg, and others interacted constantly. Each month during the session, Charles attended the evening work sessions in which the presidents generally sorted out our agreements and our disagreements and shared whatever news we had. Charles and I developed a friendship that was, for me, a source of constant learning, of shared experiences. Both of us in those days were at work on our second great capital campaigns, and these were massive efforts indeed. And we had a shared awareness that we shared one job and one set of larger commitments. What Charles taught all of us in those days was that our missions as universities and as women and men are ultimately the same, that our differences do not matter at the end of the day, that what may sound trite, which is that we are all in this together, is in fact also true and fundamental. Working on solutions to needs in Northern Virginia, in Danville, in Abingdon, in Virginia Beach, and elsewhere. We worked out new kinds of regional centers. We found new ways to allocate our state appropriations. We found new ways to bond capital construction, and under new rules that emphasized institutional responsibility. Charles talked sometimes in those days about the farm in Buckingham County, about work to be shared with his brother, about his and Janet's life in Blacksburg and their intentions for the years after his term as president. Charles talked about using the Virginia Tech campus in Switzerland, now named for him, and collaborating with Swiss authorities. He led the nation in campus initiatives to protect and support students and faculty members and staff in the terrible realities that all of us learned as the gunman took aim at Virginia Tech. He shared my own excitement as the ACC finally invited Virginia Tech to join. And Virginia experienced for the first time benefits similar to what our neighbors in North Carolina have had since that conference was formed in the early 1950s. Then, as my own tenure as president wrapped up in 2010, and Charles's wrapped up in 2014, we had occasions to celebrate each other. No one was more generous or kinder in remembering our work together than Charles was and than Virginia Tech's rector and board of visitors were. And John, I'm grateful to you all in very fundamental ways. Thank you. No one's kindnesses meant more in those days. My last chance to hear Charles discuss his work and his life came in Charlottesville in November 2016. Charles came for a panel discussion on disruptions on campuses before an audience of faculty members and graduate students. Charles talked about responsible leadership and briefly about his own experiences as students. He talked about the MOOCs, which were then the great national fad, about his students in urban planning, about artificial intelligence models in higher education. He acknowledged problems, needs for improvement, and opportunities to reform what we teach. He talked about using new opportunities wisely, about teaching values, and about enabling students to think and to reason. The video, which is online, shows also something else. It shows a man engaged with ideas and with people, including those scarred by disaster. A man aware that large responsibilities open up large futures. A man of prodigious experience and knowledge, and one whose gentle spirit, whose keen mind, whose uncommon courtesy, and his many visions speak eloquently of what he did in his years at Virginia Tech and of what he was.
Thank you all for being here today. And thank you for all of your kind words and good wishes. Charles Steger, my father, was a nearly impossible act to follow, or to summarize in a few words. He was also a big fan of Winston Churchill and the ability to defy even the darkest moments with humor. So we thought we might share some of his more amusing aspects, both intentional and unintentional, as we reflect on his legacy. So if I tell one of his stories that you've heard maybe 10 or 15 times before, you'll recall that that was just his style. Now, for those of you who knew him even a little bit, if you picture him in your mind, I'll bet you he's wearing a suit and tie. Dr. Smoot, I know that's the case. Now, that's just because it was really hard to catch him without a tie on. He came from a very spirited, very strong, and frequently hilarious family. His brother Keith, sisters Linda and Jennifer, who always teased him about those ties. I think he started taking himself seriously long before anyone else ever did. But he dressed up every day for nearly 50 years because of the way he respected this place and his incredible friends and colleagues. And because he was so single-mindedly focused on getting things done, he came to work. Now that my brother David and I are 35 and 39, respectively, the idea that he was a dean at 33 seems like it must have been some kind of a clerical error. But he seemed to find more hours in the day and more days in the week than the rest of us. I think I was probably 10 years old by the time I realized that most people don't go to work on Saturdays. I'm not sure anyone has told David yet. Home football games at least kept him out of the office, but those of you who tried to watch the game in his presence know that he was working there too. He never really got into taking vacations, and the concept of retirement seemed to entirely escape him. Though he did spend a bit more time on the golf course or manning the grill, and I understand that he even began to occasionally show up at the office without a tie on. Maybe that was his small concession to retirement, or maybe it was just to make the rest of us feel a bit better about ourselves. In spite of his formal trappings, he was in many ways still just a country boy at heart. He spent his childhood summers on the family farm by the James River, enjoying the company of his horses and cattle and beagle dogs and playing bluegrass tunes on his guitar. He was an accomplished horseman, and to hear him tell it, his childhood seems to have been composed almost entirely of getting up hay. He told us a lot of stories about growing up and values that he learned on the farm, and while I barely know a baler from a bush hog myself, he made it clear that if we didn't straighten up and fly right, we would find out how to get up some hay. That's motivating to a young man. Now, there were several occasions when someone who didn't know his background would try to tease him by proposing that he ride their horse or play a song with their band. They thought they could have a little fun at his expense. But he would jump in without batting an eye or removing his tie and set them straight right then and there about just who it was they were dealing with. He always got a kick out of that. He dreamed of someday building a house on the farm overlooking the river, and he just recently finished that house. And he certainly wasn't planning on leaving us so soon, because he was still so inspired and so excited about all the things he had going on. He was excited about the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, the Global Forum on Urban and Regional Resilience, the Virginia Biocomplexity Institute, and how they could change the world with big, groundbreaking ideas. He was also excited about his poetry prize, and the Renaissance Music Academy, and the Steger Center in Switzerland, and the Boys and Girls Clubs of Central Virginia, and how they could enrich individual lives through the arts. His contributions frequently took the form of raising funds for those causes, and looking out at the folks assembled today, I think he was very often raising your funds. So thank you for your support. He was a good person. He was not necessarily a very patient person, but my mother has always operated with a surplus of patience, so perhaps they complemented each other that way. He was also a kind person. But make no mistake, he was still a tough customer. When you get a chance, just ask David Ehrlich about the negotiations for that beautiful Bergonzi violin he's playing today, or Conrad Frey about purchasing the Villa Moderni in Switzerland. He was proud of those deals. But he was often kind when he didn't have to be, spending time with the custodians and the grounds crews and the folks who make this place beautiful every day, or going out of his way to learn the customs of international students and families to make them feel at home. So, as we honor the man today, on this campus and in this building that he was so very proud of, if your arm feels that old familiar twist to contribute to one of his favorite causes, then you'll just have to do as the Spirit moves you. But it would also be a fitting tribute if someday soon you would take an extra moment to be kind to someone. Be kind to someone, even though you don't have to, and maybe wear a tie. Thank you.
A letter to Charles on behalf of all of us. Dear Charles, we celebrate today as family and friends because you raised the bar. An architect who saw beyond time and place, you asked for our best and challenged our imagination. Your Hokie ambassadors make a difference both near and far. It's been a privilege, Charles, and now our consolation. Well done, Mr. President, well done. We love you. Amen.
This afternoon has taken a set of memories and stories of Charles Steger and created, I think, at least for me, an indelible memory that I'll never forget. It'll be a guiding light for me as I continue to hold the reins of this institution at Virginia that Charles Steger put on a path to preeminence and to impact in a spirit of prosum. Thank you all for being here, and along with our speakers, expressing your love, your admiration, and appreciation for Charles and his family. It demonstrates, as best as we're able, just how much Charles Steger's life touched all of us and how he transformed this university, this community, the Commonwealth, the world of higher education, and beyond. His legacy will continue as strong and as enduring as the Hokie stone around us. For me, those stones always call to mind his spirit, and his vision. This concludes our service. You're invited to join us in the reception that follows. Would you please stand and remain at your seats while the family exits the theater?